Hello everyone, welcome to another black pilling video about the future clown decade. Because we're in 2021 and I want to go through some polls that indicate that maybe the next decade is only going to get worse. Because unfortunately, as I think everyone watching this channel knows, being right-wing in any way, in the UK especially, puts you in a sort of minority status. Or at least that's the impression you get from all the media we see. But for people my age, of about 25 or in their mid-20s, that is actually true, as I will go through. So, from the Times, woke culture war is biggest dividing line among voters. Frank Luntz, a veteran American pollster, says Labour faces a challenge in keeping its support base while appealing to the wider public. Now, just before I get into the article properly, I do want to point out that Frank Luntz is actually quite a big player when it comes to polling and to politics. Having worked for decades with the Republican Party to try and change the language we use on some issues. For instance, he was the person who changed the language around global warming to climate change to make it seem less of a threat, but also changed the word inheritance tax to death tax to make that tax seem a lot worse. And obviously while doing this, he was working in the polls for years and acting as a pundit and helped with communications in the Republican Party. And it appears that he is not a particular fan of the woke culture. In fact, he wrote this article for the Times this year. He says, resist the UK-style woke mob coming for the royal family, and it has this paragraph in. Increasingly, your nation and mine bow to vicious tweets, vapid celebrities, and the virtue signalling of our modern world. That's the woke creed, and it will chew up and spit out everything in its wake. So as you can tell from this, at the very least, he is anti-woke, though he left the Republican Party a few years back to come and work as a pollster in the UK, as he is an Anglophile. So to put it simply, the man knows what he's talking about when it comes to polls and when it comes to public opinion. So given that these polls were done with the help of Frank Luntz, I think we can say that they are fairly accurate, and so worth going through. So we may as well get right into it. Wokeism and the culture wars are on course to becoming the biggest dividing line in British politics, a prominent pollster has concluded after significant research into voter attitudes. Frank Luntz, who spent nearly 3 decades carrying out the work of the Republican Party in the US and advised presidents including George W. Bush on political language, said that within 6 to 12 months cultural divisions in Britain would catch up with those in the United States, because as me and quite a few of the other YouTubers such as Mitch have been saying, we are being Americanized, and we need to stop being Americanized because Britain is not America. They come from the same starting point in around 1776, but then they tend to branch off quite a bit. And so we need to make Britain British again. The problem with woke and with cancel culture is that it is never done. The conflict and divisions never end, he said. This is not what the people of the UK want, but it's coming anyway. And that's why we're in a clown decade. Though I do have to say, before I comment on this, I do love this little paragraph from the Times, just for the people on the Times who don't really understand what the term woke means. Their description is, the term woke refers to someone concerned with social issues such as race and trans rights. No, that is what people who self-describe as woke say it is. What woke really refers to when most people are referring to it, especially when it's derogatory, is someone who advocates for authoritarian measures to have incredibly egalitarian policies and laws for the end goal of equality between all different classes, I suppose, though they do tend to be physical characteristics in terms of classes, not the actual old proletariat versus bourgeoisie classes. And the main problem with this is that it will completely bring down all successful individuals and not even attempt to raise up those that may be struggling, because it just wants everyone to the same common denominator, because that is the only way you are going to get equality, whether that's what they want or not. Well, we know that's not what they want, because as Aaron Bastani said, fully automated luxury communism is when everyone has an infinity pool. And unfortunately these people are somewhat popular, but again we'll go into it now. But another issue with this is that it's implying that Frank Luntz is saying that he is against race and trans issues, which isn't necessarily the case here, because this is the problem with the word woke. The Times and a lot of other places seem to only listen to the leftists when it comes to the term woke, and so that is the definition that generally goes round to them. So when I say I'm anti-woke, That to them means I'm a big old racist and transphobe. So anyway, we should get back to the article and find out why cancel culture and wokeism is coming anyway. So, Luntz, who travelled to London and joined the Centre for Policy Studies in May to conduct the research, found that wokeism was a top 3 cause of concern among voters, more than sexism or populism. Interesting. In a study involving focus groups and polls of several thousand people, he found that voters believed that woke versus non-woke was a greater divide than the north versus south, cities versus rural areas, and women versus men or young versus old divides. Luntz, who was a contemporary of Boris Johnson at Oxford, has carried out polling for his campaign to be elected Oxford Union President, found that support for the 2 main political parties in Britain was increasingly split along such cultural lines. Some 81% of Tory voters agreed that the UK was a nation of equality and freedom, while 19% said it was institutionally racist and a discriminatory nation. So that means that about 19% of the Tory voters are Prosecco Tories, i.e. people who may as well have joined the Lib Dems. Among Labour voters, 52% agreed with the former and 48% with the latter. So it's the old 52/48 divide again, with Labour just edging out on saying that the UK is institutionally racist and discriminatory. So I think this is a massive problem, because clearly it is a slightly more popular opinion to say that the UK is a land of freedom and equality, and I just hope to God that they mean equality under the law, because I can't imagine that they mean equality of outcome or anything like that, because there's no way we have equality of outcome in this country, because we're not a failing state. But the problem is that minority opinion of this place being a racist and sexist hellhole seems to be the opinion that MPs are following, with most parties trying to put forward, well, Labour for the main example being the ones put forward a race-based manifesto, also trying to do everything they can to have minority status-based rights outweigh those of universal rights. And the Tories seem to try and push something through like that, albeit at a much slower rate. But this just keeps begging the question, why? And the reason I personally think at this point why is because people with that minority opinion are the louder voice. They're the ones probably writing to their MPs, making constant pressure groups, and pressurising all the parties to do what they wish. So I think a good counter to that would be to have, well, properly right-wing pressure groups, because there really aren't that many in the UK. And the ones that are generally only right-wing economically, to some extent, and then quite left-wing culturally. A good example is that they want complete free immigration for 3 million Hong Kongers to come over, and they say, oh, just place a new city for 3 million people somewhere randomly in a green zone, that'll do. Whereas I think a bit more thought needs to go behind something like that. But carrying on with this report's findings, according to the findings, 40% of all voters believe cancel culture enforces a thought and speech police that can ruin lives, and that's probably because there has been countless examples where this has happened, while 25% think it is a good thing because if you say something sexist or racist, you should face the consequences, which is a really vague way of saying I have a massive power fantasy. Luntz said that woke issues were becoming dominant in British political culture. Woke begets woke, he said. It's a narrative that Labour is promoting now, but the Conservatives will pick up as a reaction. Well, they've already done that. They've been doing that for at least a decade. The damage and the consequences of this chasm is awful. When you have decided that your country is institutionally racist and discriminatory, you don't normally go back. Well, the experiment for that right now is the US, so I guess keep an eye on that. But it is good to see the Times reporting this and pointing out that Frank Luntz is saying just what is true, that all wokeism does is divide people and cause divisions. But then he goes a bit further and says something that I don't entirely agree with. He says that the divide on Britain is everything. Culturally, Labour prioritises British identity, the Conservatives prioritise British tradition. Again, I don't think that's true. I think the Conservatives prioritise British tradition and identity, where Labour try and completely destroy British identity and completely change the definition of it to mean basically anyone who's in Britain at this point. I mean, when I said to a few of my leftist friends that I agreed with John Cleese when he said London isn't an English city, they all said, what do you mean? It's a city in England. It's just, that's not good enough to have the character of England if half of it isn't even English. But I don't know. Identity on any sort of British identity or English identity seems to be completely eroded in the minds of basically people who are leftists. But he then goes on to say that economically Labour prioritises equality and the Conservatives prioritise hard work. Again, I don't think that's necessarily true. The Conservatives certainly aren't being as egalitarian with their economic policies as Labour, but they're still putting forward HS2. They're still trying to plan to spend more than our GDP on our infrastructure and just different projects like that. And I don't see any recent plans to try and cut taxes to any meaningful degree. You still pay 40% of your tax if you're in the top band. You're essentially working 2 days a week for the government at that point. Why the hell would anyone agree to that? But he finishes by saying, on just about every single issue, there is a chasm within the country. Now, this I would tend to agree with. There is definitely a lot of polarisation these days on, I don't know about every issue, but certainly most issues. But one of the main problems is that you can't just say, oh, Labour voters are all on this side of the chasm while Tories are all on the other side. There's a lot of interconnection and, well, inbreeding between issues and voters. And I think a big part of that reason is just simply for the fact that the populace isn't that engaged in politics. And they're instead engaged in tribalism. But I mean, I can't really blame them for that. That's just human nature. And Frank even points this out in his article. He said age and political affiliation were the biggest dividing lines when it came to views on woke issues and the culture war. I'm seeing things that you are going to see in 6 months to a year from now. It's already done significant damage to our system in the US. It prioritises equality over meritocracy. We're becoming intolerant of tolerance. We are writing each other off out of our lives. The damage and the consequences of that chasm is awful. The consequences are so significant: less cooperation, less compromise, more negativity, which are things I'm really trying to avoid in my life and this country. And unfortunately, these consequences already appear to be happening in the UK. So, from another article, this poll and its results are shown, and it says, have you ever stopped talking to someone, whether in person or online, because of something political they had said? And majority of people aged 18 to 29 say yes. That is 53% of young people have stopped talking and associating with someone because of their political opinion. And as you can see with most polls like this, the older you get, the more sensible you appear to get, at least with this snapshot. And the problem is that I think it's just a cope to say, oh, well, that means when they get older, they'll get more sensible. No, I don't see any reason that they do that. I think that's just a cope. Because these people have been surrounded by the ideas that equality is everything, and basically if people disagree with you, then they must be Nazis or fascists. And I see no reason why they'd stop thinking that, because there are still people who are older who think similar things, and this is probably where the ideas have come from, because it's mainly these people who stay in universities and don't actually do anything with their lives. And what I find kind of most interesting about this is this next poll result. So this says, has someone ever stopped talking to you, whether in person or online, because of something political you said? And again, it's mostly 18 to 29-year-olds that seem to be affected by this. So within generations, it seems that these problems exist. So, for example, I mean, I guess that millennials and Zoomers expect their elderly grandparents to say something racist politically or something like that. So I guess they're more tolerant of it. But, I mean, I myself have had people stop talking to me because it turns out I'm right-wing. I mean, obviously that's going to happen. I am a Zoomer. Though having said that, vast majority of my friends are actually very tolerant of my views. And I think one of the main reasons for that is that I didn't really make friends with intolerant people because I thought they were twats. But I can only see this trend continuing, and to be honest, I can only see the next generation coming in being worse, because now not only do we have the people who were brought up in a schooling system that makes them think like this, but they are now also teaching in it, and they're only going to make the next generation more radical on this. So, for the love of God, either send your kids to private school or homeschool them. Because another issue I'm seeing in regards to this is that while the younger generation tend to be incredibly intolerant, they also don't know anything, especially about economics. So the Institute of Economic Affairs, a centre-right think tank in the UK that focuses on economics, obviously, have made a recent report called Left Turn Ahead, surveying attitudes of young people towards capitalism and socialism, which was published by Christian Niemitz today, in fact. So as you can see on screen, the first thing that they do in this survey is put forward the definitions for socialism and capitalism. So they asked people which of the following two descriptions comes closest to the understanding of what free market capitalism means. So is it the economic system where business, trade and industry is mostly run and owned by private companies for profit, or is it mostly owned by the government? And this graphic shows the results of when they asked which of these two definitions fit socialism. You'll only see that less than half of Zoomers and Millennials actually get it right. And given how basic this definition is, that is beyond embarrassing. But not only that, it appears that this study also shows that Millennials and Zoomers are completely contradictory when it comes to stated preferences and, well, other stated preferences. So when asked, should the private sector involvement put the NHS at risk, most people, and we're talking 70% and less for Zoomers, or 70% and over for Millennials, agree that private sector involvement will put the NHS at risk. But then when asked, we have nothing to fear from private sector involvement in healthcare as long as it is accessible to everybody, again, majority agree that that's okay, with about 57% of Millennials agreeing, and just below 70% of Zoomers agreeing. So, as it turns out, they have no idea what they're talking about. But the last bar charts I will go through are these ones, because they do what literally everyone does, which is when they are asked, should people be paid more tax for public services and benefits, just less than 60% of both strongly agreed or agreed. But then asked, should people be taxed less because the government will not spend it wisely, just over 60% of both agreed. So it appears that, like most people, they are just tribal in most cases and go purely off intuition, which is a huge problem we have, well, throughout human history. But this is why I think we are going to have a massive problem with cancel culture and wokeism for at least the next decade and probably longer. Because it plays perfectly off people's intuition when their rhetoric is nothing but, oh, you're anti-racist, aren't you? You're against racism. Well, guess what? The way you do that is by basically pulling down everyone who's successful to bring up the less successful demographics, let's say. And while people might be sceptical of that at first, it appears that the future of our government, which is the Millennials and Zoomers, are probably going to be right behind that. I mean, you can see that quite clearly with all the young Labour MPs we see today, such as Zara Sultana and Nadia Witomi, who are two Labour MPs who are fairly young and constantly push race grifting, wokeness, and support everything that David Lammy pushes. So it doesn't look good, but while we've still got this system, we still have to be putting our rhetoric forward and pointing out and even try and get people to be disgusted at ideas coming from wokeism, which is what I try and do all the time, by pointing out how it's just pure oppression, how it is just pure racism, and how the results of it are actually despicable. The facts do matter to an extent, but the rhetoric also matters quite a lot. It's going to take a lot of work, and we definitely need pressure groups to be pushing in the other direction. Luckily, there might be projects in the back end of this channel that might be doing something just to help that, but, well, I don't want to give too much away. But that's everything I've got for you today. So, as usual, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.